Hi everyone, this is Daniel Gregg from Torah Times, and this is, I think it's July 11th, 2023, and I'm going to make a follow-up video or an additional video to the Titus 1:15 video, which we talked about in a few videos back. You can go look that up. So I want to explain some more technical points on this, but nevertheless important points that maybe I didn't emphasize enough in the last video. So I will read Titus 1:15 again for you, and we'll zero in on this technical point. Okay, so the phrase is, all things are clean in the clean. And the point here is that I have translated in the clean rather than to the clean. Okay, so I want to explain how we came about within the clean and what it means. So first, let's explain what it means. To say to someone would be external. All things are clean to the clean. So that's external to the person. But if we say all things are clean in the clean, then that means that if someone, as I explained in the last video about this topic, if someone is clean because they obey the Word of God and they heed what it says and obey it, and keep the commandments, not to make themselves unclean, then they are indeed clean. So all things in the clean are clean, or all things are clean in the clean. So this may sound somewhat tautologous, but it's another one of Paul's gotcha phrases, because as taken from the point of view of the Gnostics, the means of being clean would be different from the biblical means of being clean or being cleansed, which is by the Word, which is through the commandments and the sanctification of Messiah Yeshua. Okay, so let me explain how we came about with the translation in here. So the Greek word here that I've translated in the, instead of to the, is the Greek word tois. Okay, so that's a definite article in the dative case. And the important thing here is that the dative case can be translated several ways. And one of those ways of translating would be a dative of location, all right, which you would translate it in the, okay, or a dative of sphere is what they might call it. And then the dative with the to would be a dative of respect, and you would use the word to before the definite article. So all things are clean in the clean rather than to the clean would give the sense. Now, in order to prove the point, I want to look at some other texts. Now, just before I'll give you a little background on this, scholars will tell you that to know whether a dative is a dative of location or a dative of a respect, you have to depend on the context to know. The actual words can go possibly two ways. So you have to use the context to know whether it would be to the clean or in the clean. And so now that they say that in the scholarly resources, it's quite clear that someone can pick one or the other depending on their theological prejudice and what they think the context might mean. Okay, well, we have the context of the Torah and the prophets and the Levitical laws of clean and clean, what to eat and what not to eat. So you can be clean by obeying the commandments. All right, so I'm going to show by some examples here that to versus in can make a big difference. Okay, so the first passage I want to look at here is Ephesians 2:1. Well, actually, let's go and look at something more obvious. Let's go look at Romans 6, chapter 2, and then we'll come back to Ephesians 2:1. Okay, so in Romans 6:2, let's see here. Reading from the Good News of Messiah. May it never be. How can we who die to sin still live in it? Okay, so this could potentially be translated die in sin. Okay, you could translate the dative here. It's a definite article with a dative. How can we die to sin? How can we who die to sin still live in it? Okay, so you see the idea here is dying to sin, but the language is ambiguous. It could mean dying in sin. Okay, so in English, obviously, to die to sin means something different from to die in sin. To die in sin means to have your sins still upon you. To die to sin means to be repentant from it, or to be getting a divorce from sin and having nothing to do with it. So here we would translate this as a dative of respect using the word to, and not with a dative using in. Okay, now we can go over to Ephesians 2:1 and we'll see why the ambiguity makes a difference. Okay, in Ephesians 2:1, in the regular translations it says, and I'm going to have to go off of memory here, but I'll put the text up on the screens for you. It says, you who were dead in transgressions. You who were dead in transgressions. Okay. I'll put up the good news of Messiah here and I'll explain the difference. Okay, good news of Messiah. Even you, now being dead to your transgressions and iniquities. So the question is it being dead in transgressions or being dead to transgressions? Okay, so this is another case of a dative usage, a definite article with a case ending, which could be translated as to or in. Okay, so in this context, I translated it dead to transgressions because the verb before it is in the present tense. You being dead to transgressions. So Paul's talking to the faithful and he's talking to them in the present tense. And being dead to transgressions has the same sense as in Romans 6:2, being dead to sin, okay? In other words, repenting from it. Okay, but you could translate the Ephesians 2 passage as being dead in sin. And since, of course, being in the present tense no longer makes any sense, they changed that to a past tense, you who were dead in transgressions. And it's turned into a teaching for the doctrine of total depravity. So you can see how translating the dative case can actually go both ways here, and how the theological prejudices of the translator will affect the translation. So the standard translations have were dead in transgressions, which is against the context of the present tense there. Okay, and also it's against Paul's previous usage of the similar clause where it's talking about being dead to transgressions in Romans 6, which suggests that here also in Ephesians 2, that the translation should be dead to transgressions. Okay, so that's showing you the ambiguity. All right, so now I want to go over to another passage. This one is in Colossians 2:13. Okay, where likewise I have translated, and you being dead to transgressions and to the uncircumcision of your flesh. Okay, so this is a side issue which I'm not going to go in here, but the Colossians received the message by a young man who came to see Paul, and then he heard the good news and he took it back to Colossae. The Colossians were, in fact, as a rule, already circumcised before they came to Yeshua. So that's why Paul is able to use the figures of speech here in the way he does. Okay, and you being dead to transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh. And of course, he's using uncircumcision of your flesh there, besides not just allusion to physical circumcision, but also to the fact that they were behaving in a fleshly manner before they received Messiah. Okay, in other words, immorally, using flesh as a figure of speech for sinful behavior. All right. So the point is it's in the present tense, and you being dead to transgressions, which of course the translations again change this to a past tense, were dead in transgressions, because the doctrine of total depravity and them being quote unquote spiritually dead and incapable of any response or incapable of doing anything without the what you would call a Gnostic regeneration taking place. Now, of course, God's sanctification is needed in transforming a person, but he doesn't overrule a person's. He presents them with the news, and then he gives them the chance to respond one way or the other. Okay, so this is another case of the dative case being taken the wrong way. Now, in the footnote, and this is important, and it'll tell you that the Greek scribes understood the difference. Okay, 2:13. Okay, I'm back. I found the information that I was looking for. In the Colossians 2:13 passage, there's a difference in the Greek manuscripts. If you look in the Nestle Aland 27th edition, you will see that before the dative, the word "en" is bracketed in before the definite article. And that's to say that the scribes inserted the word in the text to clarify the dative. But it's of doubtful, the text has some doubt about it because they put it in brackets. So I support the reading without the extra word in the text, so that it reads, being dead to, and you being dead to transgressions and to the uncircumcision of your flesh. Okay, so I'll read you the footnote here. Okay, on Ephesians 2:1, the dative lacks the preposition in, and therefore should be translated to. So in the Ephesians 2 passage, that would be being dead to transgressions. Okay, the same, okay, so, and the whole phrase means being repentant. The dative lacks a preposition in. Okay, I read that. The same is the case in Ephesians 2:5. So if we look over there, Paul repeats the same phrase, and we now, being dead to transgressions, okay, and not who were, not a past tense there, okay. So the present participle ontos being replaced in three places is no accident. The present participle ontos being repeated in three places is no accident. Okay, so on verse 4, the word now is interpolated to help deprogram the jaded Reformed reader of the past tense heresy used to bolster the doctrine of regeneration. Okay, so while it is easy to interpret we're dead in, which is how they want to translate it, away from Reformed doctrine, it is only a stopgap defense because the translation is also wrong. And that's because they took the dative the wrong way. It should be dead to transgressions and not dead in transgressions. Okay, so one more example of the dative being translated this time in. If we look in the book of Luke, over here to Luke 24:46. And he said to them, thus it has been getting written, that the anointed should suffer and rise again from the dead the third day. Now, in my translation, I just don't translate the dative at all. I just put the third day and make it an object. But if you were to look in a translation like the ESV, it would say on the third day. Or if you would look in the ESV interlinear, it would say on or in the third day. So they're interpreting this as a dative of sphere, okay? So it's just a definite article before the word third here. Okay, so you could translate this potentially to the third day, okay, as a dative of reference, but obviously it makes sense as on or in the third day, a dative of sphere. Okay, and another remark about prepositions in English is that Greek doesn't make a distinction between on and in a context like this in the dative, but for some strange reason in English, we say on such and such a day, whereas in Greek and Hebrew, you would say in such and such a day. Okay, so on has a connotation of literally speaking of being on the surface of something or on top of it. Okay, so prepositions get used in strange ways in different languages, and this is part of the reason for the confusion. So when the Greek reader is reading the dative, he will mentally supply from the context one of the two senses of the dative, the to or the in. In other words, the dative of reference or the dative of sphere, in. Okay, so if we go back to all things are clean in the clean, we can see how, with the explanation I've given you in this video and in the last video, how this makes more sense and makes the text more compliant with the Torah to understand it this way. Okay. Okay, so now I want to bring up another translational topic here. The word all is often used in the scope of the context of what somebody is talking about. So for instance, in Romans 14, when Paul gets specific about what subjects concerning food that he was talking about, it turns out that the subject was meat and wine or drink. It was meat and drink, okay? Specifically wine and meat, as versus being a teetotaler or being a vegetarianism, or being a total vegetarian. And of course, we see that people, for religious reasons, even today, don't drink wine and they don't eat meat. They're vegetarians or they're not. Okay, so this is the scope of what Paul is talking about in this context. So when he uses the word all, he means all of these, or all of the things that here are on my list, or the list of your questions that I'm giving you an answer about. It doesn't mean all in an absolutist sense. Otherwise, all in an absolutist sense could mean poison, for that matter, okay? But it means the things that are under discussion. Now, to give you some examples of how all is limited, I want to go to a couple texts here. Okay, the first one I want to go to is 1 Corinthians 15:28. First Corinthians 15:28. Now this passage is used by Arian or eternal subordinate, those who hold the doctrine of the eternal subordination of the Son, to demote Yeshua from being equal to God, okay? But I'm not going to go into that part here. I'm just going to give you the conclusion, okay? So verse 28 reads, "And when all things shall have been subordinated to him, then the Son himself will have been submitted to him who submitted all things to him, wherein the Almighty may be both of these things in all things." Okay, so what it's saying here is that the Almighty will be both in the position of submitting and in the position of ruling or being king. In other words, he's taken both the position of the servant and both the position of the potentate. All right? So wherein the Almighty may be both of these in all things. Now the usual translations say all in all or all things in all things. But you can't absolutize the sense as all because obviously God never takes the role of the devil. Okay, so in an absolute sense, he's not being all in that sense. So all is limited to the things in the context, namely ruling and submitting. All right? And so in this case, I translated the word all as both of these and all things. Now, if you look up the word pas in the BDAG lexicon, you will see that it has this sense in the definition, and it will actually allow you to translate the word each, that is, each of some things in the categories or a list of items that have been mentioned, okay? Meaning every one of the items in the list, okay? So let's look at Acts 2:5. Okay, a couple more texts here to illustrate this sense. Acts 2:5. Okay. No, wrong book again. Here we go. In Jerusalem there were dwelling Yehudim, devout men from every nation of those under heaven. Okay, so if we take this in the absolute sense, then we would have to say that there were Jews in every nation on earth and that they were all there on the day of Pentecost. Okay, but clearly that doesn't make sense. And the commentators recognize that it doesn't make sense. So almost all of them tell us that we're dealing with a hyperbole here. In other words, with an exaggeration. Okay, now I'm going to show you that it's not an exaggeration because something has been overlooked in the text here. In Jerusalem, there were dwelling in Yehudim, devout men from every nation of those under heaven. Okay, so now if you look at an ESV translation, you will see that the words of those are missing from the last clause, and it just says from every nation under heaven. But in the Greek, there's an extra definite article in the phrase, which is in the plural, sandwiched between those words, so that it reads every nation of those or of the ones under heaven. So the question is what does those refer to? Okay, well, if you look at the gender of the definite article, you will see that it doesn't agree with nations. So if you assume that those mean as a points back to nations, you would be incorrect. Actually, it agrees with, actually to correct myself, the article has an ambiguous gender in this context, but the interlinears will tell you that it agrees with nations, okay? But in fact, you have to have a little more knowledge that the Greek interlinear discloses, because the Greek interlinear won't disclose the ambiguity of the Greek genitive plural tone. It could also agree with a masculine antecedent. Okay, in this case, it agrees with Yehudim, okay, which is the Jews. So this is how you would read the text, supplying what the antecedent points to. In Jerusalem there were dwelling Yehudim, devout men from every nation of the Jews under heavens. Okay, so what does it mean, every nation of Jews? Okay, well, when the Jews were scattered after the Babylonian exile, they weren't scattered all over the earth. They were scattered in nearby nations to the Holy Land, to Babylon, to Egypt, to Asia Minor, to North Africa, to Parthia, to Arabia. Okay, and when they went to those places, they intermarried with the local population, so they became, the Jews gained different ethnicities, or they became ethnic Jews according to the nations that they dwelt in. So you would have Parthian Jews and Roman Jews and Cyrenian or North African Jews and Arab Jews, okay? So when it says from every nation of those Jews, nation of those refers to Jews with the local ethnicity, okay? Actually, the word here is, I believe, ethnus, okay, from which we get our word ethnic, okay? So the phrase isn't an exaggeration because there, there weren't ethnic Jews in every nation on earth. For instance, if you go, like in Germany, okay, or you would go to the tribes of Central Africa, or all the way over to Japan or China or North America. Okay, so obviously nobody was there from those places on the day of Shavuot in AD 34. So it's important here that the phrase is qualified from every nation of those Jews, or ethnicity of the Jews under heaven. Okay, in Jerusalem there were dwelling devout men from every nation of those Jews under heaven. So that's the qualification. It's limiting the sense of the phrase here. Okay, so this is telling us that the word all or every can be limited by the context in which it occurs. Okay, so when Paul is asked about meat, meat and wine, and he says all is clean, he means meat and wine. He doesn't mean things that are unclean. Okay, so let's bounce back over to Romans 14 here, and I'll show you how we put the translation, or how I put the translation. Okay, so in Romans 14:20, let's see here. Do not be tearing down the work of the Almighty for the sake of food. Both of these are clean in the clean, or all of these are clean in the clean, is how I put it. All right. Okay, so the word is all in the plural. It's referring to more than one item, but it's like the all in the Corinthians passage we read. That means all of what's being talked about in the context. Okay, so I translated it just to avoid the misunderstanding which has been programmed into our minds by constant false teaching coming from the institutional church. Okay, so both of these are clean. Okay, now with this understanding, we could do without the additional phrase in Romans 14:20. Both of these are clean in the clean. But why did I put it like Titus 1:15? Well, the reason is because a scribe, an editor or a corrector of Codex Sinaiticus actually copied the extra words into the margin, showing, and when they do this, it means that, oh, we overlooked this. We know that other manuscripts have the reading of in the clean in them, like in Titus 1:15. Now, scholars have blamed this on assimilation to Titus 1:15, but I think there's good reason to believe that it's not assimilation to Titus 1:15, and that's because the ancient Ethiopian Bible also contains these words, so that Romans 14:20 reads, both of these are clean in the clean. Okay, so Paul is hinting at his other argument here, and you could look in the footnotes here. So here's what I say. The words tois, katharos were copied into the margin of Codex Sinaiticus by a corrector sometime after the 4th century and before the end of the 7th century. The deletion needs no explanation, having arisen from the desire to reinterpret the passage toward the abolishment of the Levitical laws. Okay, like I said, though, the phrase could still be interpreted correctly without replacing the missing words, on the force of realizing that the word all refers to what Paul is talking about. Okay, but if we let the subject get expanded, then Paul could be talking about the false doctrine of the Gnostics here, or at least hinting at it. If this is what you would call a trope phrase that he was using um, in a different sense. Okay, he might be including that here. Okay, so we have two witnesses testifying to the missing text. The passage parallels Titus 1:15. A third witness to Paul's meaning, it's another way of stating Romans 14:14. Okay, which, what does that say? We've read that before. In the video going back. Okay, I think I need to pause this because it looks like it's going to shut off on me. Okay, so Romans 14:14 all over again here. I have been knowing and have been getting persuaded in Adonai Yeshua that nothing is sharing defilement on its own. Okay, except to him who is taking account anything to be sharing defilement. To him it is sharing defilement. Okay, so both of these are clean in the clean. So of course, if you think it defiles you and it's not clean in your conscience, then your conscience is going to be defiled. But if your conscience is clean and you realize that you're allowed to eat it by the word of God, then it will be clean to you. So Paul is hinting at a further idea here. If it's accidental, it's clean. Okay, it doesn't defile your conscience. But if it's intentional, then it defiles your conscience. And this is at a level aside from ritual impurity. Okay, ritual impurity can come about by accident, but not defilement of the conscience. Okay, as long as it remains an unknown thing. Okay, so let's see if we covered everything here. Yeah, I think we covered everything here, and we covered the scholarly basis for the corrections and putting the word in. All things are clean in the clean in Titus 1:15, and showing that this problem crops up in other places like Ephesians, where using the word incorrectly, using the word in is done in the service of the doctrine of total depravity, and then corrupting the present tense to a past tense in Ephesians 2:1 and Ephesians 2:5, and making the same mistake in Colossians 2:13, where Paul is just trying to talk about repentance, not this Augustinian doctrine of total depravity. All right, so thank you for listening. Dan Gregg, over and out.